Okay, so we're going to be talking this week about homelessness and subjectivity, and David's going to be drawing upon his own empirical research that was mostly to do with your PhD, yeah?
Both some work that I did in my PhD, and then subsequent to that, I did some further work on a similar topic, but in a different context, in a rural context.
Okay.
So it's kind of two research projects spaced out over a few years. One of them finished up in about 2009, and one of them finished up in about 2012 or 13.
Okay. So we can just start off here with some background information about homelessness. One of the things I used to do in my first year tutes is to get everyone to shut their eyes and picture a homeless person and then describe it. And more often than not, they would describe an old man with a big beard, with ripped clothing, pushing around a trolley. It's not really the case, is it?
No, it's not really the case, but it's interesting because that image is actually exactly the image that the homeless young people that I spoke to have in their mind of a homeless person.
Right.
And one of the things that really surprised me that was that their stereotypes about homelessness are actually very similar to everybody else's.
Right.
So I'm not surprised that that's what your students said, because that's kind of what everyone says.
Well, that's really interesting. So there are people actually experiencing what they were stereotyping. We're using the stereotype to
Yeah,
describe what was going on.
well, when I, I'm going to go through this
Yeah.
a little bit later, but basically, young people felt like homelessness. There were two things going on. First, they felt like homelessness was associated with a very narrow image, and it was an older man. The beard came up a lot actually as a real signifier of homelessness, because it's kind of talked about in these really kind of visually evocative terms. It's about scruffiness and being stinky and being unkempt, right?
Yep.
Um, and they kind of felt that because homelessness was associated with one very kind of narrow, very specific image, that the kind of implications of that image bled out to their own experiences of themselves, and also the way that others treated them when they were when they were being treated as a homeless person.
Yep.
But you're right that that's only one image of homelessness. I mean, homelessness is an experience that lots of different people have for lots of different reasons, and young people go through homelessness for a set of reasons which are, very kind of reflective of the way that the youth period is kind of socially structured at the moment. And they have a very specific experience as young people. But there's also, I mean, people leaving care is people
Yep.
leaving care that's a huge problem, because there's nothing for them institutionally.
Yep.
Women fleeing domestic violence
Yep.
is a huge cause of homelessness. Yeah. So homelessness is an experience that lots of people have for lots of different reasons, but it's interesting because it's associated with a very narrow set of ideas.
Yep. Okay. And on the screen there, I've got some stats. Some are a little bit dated. It tends to be that young people are overrepresented in the stats. They tend to be the majority of.
Yeah, young people are disproportionately represented
Yep.
in homelessness stats. So there's something about being young that makes it more likely that you will go through homelessness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So as the things that Dave's already started to point out, the stats can only tell us so much. And again, I'll be talking about stats a little bit later in the course with Alistair, very briefly, when we look at crime stats and what they represent and how they're often used distortively or can actually distort what's really going on. Okay, so if you remember here, in the week 1 or 2 lecture when I was introducing the concepts, I was talking a lot about Beck and reflexive modernity and how there's an increase in uncertainty and insecurity. One of the things I pointed to that maybe is a social result of that is this kind of, extra underemployment, unemployment. There's also seemed to have been an increasing rise in homelessness during that period that Beck talks about. Do you think homelessness in the rise for young people as a result of some of those social changes that Beck talks about?
I think it's impossible to disconnect them. Yeah, I do think that. And when I look at my data, when I talk about my data a bit later on, I'm going to basically suggest that youth homelessness is really one of the kind of, in a way, one of the logical consequences of the way that individualization has impacted on young people. The kind of changes that Beck talks about has impacted on young people. But there's also some very kind of specific cultural meanings that go along with homelessness. So homelessness is both, in a way, unsurprising given social change, but also associated with a very specific set of meanings connected with the way that young people, the way that youth subjectivities work, the way that poverty is talked about in societies like ours.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I might leave it to you now to take us through your research.
Okay, great. Well, so what I'm going to do over the next little while is I'm going to try to talk about youth homelessness and try to talk about young people's identities as a way that we can look at the operation of material inequalities amongst young people. So in a way, homelessness has that kind of more general significance. But homelessness also has some very specific meanings associated with it, and it's a very specific and very profound experience that young people can have. So I'm going to try to kind of focus a bit on that, and I'll be able to share some stories that young people shared with me during a couple of research projects about their experiences of becoming homeless, of how going through homelessness changed their relationship to themselves, and how even when they left homelessness and made a home of their own, that the experience continued to have an impact on who they are. So on the slide that you'll be looking at now, what I'm wanting to point out here is that youth homelessness does not occur in a vacuum. So often youth homelessness is treated as and talked about a very specific issue, as though homelessness is kind of disconnected from the workings of the rest of society, right? As though homelessness is somehow a kind of weird or pathological outcome of an otherwise okay society. But the thing about homelessness is that it does not occur in a social or cultural vacuum, right? Homelessness is a reflection of other things. And in this slide, I've got I'm wanting to sort of raise the kind of mismatch between the cultural expectations that are on all young people about the kind of lives they're supposed to live and the actual social conditions that they're facing. So young people nowadays are expected to kind of go through these kind of neat, linear, and individually managed transitions to an independent adulthood, and that's meant to look like going to school, doing well, getting some kind of post-school education, and there's an increasing focus on university, and then kind of getting a good job and being able to pay your own rent and then making a family of your own. And it's meant to be a kind of a linear process. And the important thing is that young people are meant to do it themselves, right? Independence is really the central task here for young people. At the same time, all young people are facing some fairly difficult social conditions. There's very high levels of youth unemployment, very high levels of youth underemployment and casualisation. Education inflation refers to the fact that degrees are now more important than they've ever been, precisely because they're actually worth less, because so many people have them. This is one of the things about commodities, is when there's heaps of them, they're not worth as much, right? So a degree is now more important than it's ever been, but it is in a way less of a guarantee of a good life than it's ever been. And because of these kinds of fairly insecure conditions, young people are increasingly dependent on their parents for support. There's an increased dependence on the family home in a way in which, it may be 30 or 40 years ago there wasn't. It's just, I mean, there's a lot of anxiety now about, young people are sticking around at home too long, like that's annoying, they're pissing off their parents. But actually, they're lazy, that's right, they've got helicopter parents that can't let go of them. But the fact is that young people are staying at home, and I suspect many people listening to this will know this already. Young people are staying at home because, rent is just outrageous. The youth labour market is a joke. The young people are staying at home because they have to, structurally. So there's a mismatch there between the cultural expectations surrounding youth and the structural issues that young people are facing. And homelessness, it brings that contradiction into kind of sharp relief, I suppose. Yeah. So what the whole concept of homelessness kind of gestures towards is that there is right now a cultural association between youth and home and family. So, for example, think of the idea of leaving home. The idea of leaving home is that young people are leaving their families, and that prior to that, they're at home. Homeless young people, that's not the case for them, right? They leave home or they're kicked out for a variety of different reasons. And in that sense, they kind of transgress the normative association of youth with the family home. There's also around homelessness a kind of historical symbolic thing around the concept of home. So symbolically, having a home, having your own kind of autonomous space, and particularly home ownership has been a kind of symbol of a particular kind of identity, a kind of productive, moral identity, membership of a publicly recognized community of homed people who have their own private sphere and who can go out into the public on the basis of that. And homelessness is associated with very high levels of stigmatization and social exclusion. So homeless people are stigmatized in all sorts of ways, and my data shows that, and I'll be going through that. So there's some more stats at the top there. As Steve said earlier, homeless youth are overrepresented in homelessness stats. Basically, being young makes it more likely that you'll be homeless. The term homelessness describes a range of housing situations, and the main characteristic of these situations is insecurity, right? Homelessness is about insecurity with regards to the basic necessities of day-to-day life. In terms of a housing situation, it describes both literal and street homelessness, which is kind of what most people think about as homelessness, where you're actually sleeping outside. This is the least common form of homelessness. As you can imagine, young people will avoid this at all costs. It's very dangerous, but for both young men and women, although there are obvious gendered implications to that. Couch surfing is very common. This is young people who don't have a home, but who basically crash with people as much, with mates as much as they can, moving from one person to another, and kind of and really being dependent on this kind of very insecure generosity from friends really to survive. And then there are refuges and boarding houses. These are organizations which provide housing for young people. Refuges provide kind of 6 weeks of housing. They're usually provided by a welfare service. Boarding houses are basically, they're usually kind of privately run places in which people are referred to when they're in housing crisis. There is a huge and extremely dodgy boarding house industry in which people are paying ridiculous sums of money to live in places that, I mean, some of the stories I heard where one young person I spoke to in Melbourne turned up at a boarding house they'd been referred to at a service, and a corpse literally slid down the stairs as they were walking up them. Like, they're pretty fucked up places, basically, a lot of them. And of course, this is in the context of an unstable youth labour market, high levels of unemployment and job insecurity, a very difficult housing market. Australia has always had quite low levels of public housing, particularly in comparison to somewhere like the UK. Our policy environment tends to focus on home ownership, as the kind of contemporary anxieties around negative gearing reflect. And the private rental market is very hostile to young people. People don't tend to like renting to young people. The idea is that they'll just destroy the place. And particularly if you've been homeless, it doesn't create a very good vibe. There's a kind of suspicion towards homeless youth. So family support is really crucial for all young people to negotiate the job and housing markets. And we see that when we look at the transitions of middle-class youth, who get an enormous amount of support. Like, if a middle-class young person leaves home and they can't pay their rent, well, that's fine. They just go home, back to their family home. It's not a problem for them. But, if you're a 16-year-old girl and you've left home because of profound sexual abuse that's happening every day, maybe that's not so attractive for you. So young people who experience homelessness tend to come from very disadvantaged class backgrounds. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Poverty, of course, is a major thing that creates homelessness. But their family background also includes very high levels of family conflict, extremely high levels of physical and sexual abuse. Young people are either kicked out or they run away from home, but the distinction between those two things is kind of fuzzy. Like, if you run away from home because you're getting bashed every day, you've effectively been kicked out, really. I mean, if the street looks more attractive to you than a house that you're in, then, So what happens, though, is that basically, homelessness is what happens when family support, for whatever reason, is not available to young people, right? And without it, they're placed in a position of profound material insecurity because of the labour and housing markets, which is very hostile to them. So the main resource that they've got to draw upon to build lives is taken away from them. And so it becomes a cycle. Insecurity in work and housing creates the conditions for homelessness. Being homeless, though, it makes it more difficult to engage with work and school, because homelessness is a full-time job. Homeless young people are constantly trying to figure out where they're going to stay, how they're going to get enough money to satisfy their material needs. And the first thing that happens when a young person who is still at school becomes homeless is that they disengage from school. That happens almost straight away. So, and then, of course, you can imagine, like, holding down a job is not particularly easy when you've got nowhere to sleep or shower. Despite this, homelessness is a transient experience, and most young people are not homeless forever. There is a kind of service sector that they can negotiate, and some of them do. Some of them with less kind of problematic family backgrounds do patch it up with their parents.
Yeah.
Culturally, though, so what I'm basically trying to imply here is that youth homelessness is a pretty kind of natural part of the structural conditions that young people face, the kind of material inequalities, the labour market, the housing market, all that, right? But culturally, youth homelessness and homelessness generally really is a very specific thing because there are, as Steve alluded to earlier on, some very particular meanings associated with homelessness. Homelessness is associated with less public sympathy than simple poverty. Basically, the idea, particularly in places like Australia, where we kind of think of ourselves as a fairly egalitarian country, is that if you're poor, okay, like that sucks for you. Not everyone will blame poor people for their own poverty. But if you're homeless, the idea is that there's really something wrong with you as a person. And there's a lot of interesting, for example, psychological studies which show that faced with a narrative about someone who is having difficulties in their life, which is exactly the same, people will tend to blame the person who has become homeless for their own predicament much more than they will blame someone in an otherwise identical narrative for just being poor or struggling in life. The literature shows, and my research certainly bears out, that homeless people experience a lot of humiliation and denigration just in their day-to-day lives. There's high levels of depression and low self-esteem, of course, but what I'm going to show in the data that I'll present in a bit is that this kind of depression, low self-esteem is not really self-esteem, it's more social esteem. It's kind of people's self-esteem often are a reflection of how others see them, really. So there's high levels of shame and self-blame. So homelessness.
So their self-identity is affected by their perceived social identity.
Yeah, well, as I'm sure you've discussed, the two are impossible to dissociate. They're not. It's not the same thing, but it's impossible not to feel a certain sense of suffering when other people define you as less than dirt, which my participants did say that other people did. So whilst homelessness is within the kind of structural dynamics of youth, it needs to be understood as a very significant and particular cultural experience with implications for young people's identities. So this is just some kind of basic definitions that we can use to talk about some of the issues that my participants raised with me. This slide and the next slide will give us a bit of a conceptual framework. So, of course, the notion of identity, it talks about the way that people experience or relate to themselves. And of course, one of the central insights of sociology is that we don't just produce identities from nowhere. Identities are made available by our social environment. They're impacted by material resources we have, the kinds of cultural meanings that are around us, and we kind of actively construct identities out of resources that are available to us. And as Steve just mentioned, it's important to make a distinction between self and social identity. That is our relationship to ourselves and the attributions that people make towards us. Because even though those attributions impact on us, we all have some level of distance and can reflect to some degree on the way that others see us.
So one way, just relating back to what we've looked at the course already is obviously the relationship between self-identity and social identity is can be thought of through the notions of habitus and things like that. And what we're talking about here in some ways is what I've said before is Bourdieu talks about taste classifiers and it classifies the classifier. There's a similar process going on here in terms of the way that young people in homeless positions feel about themselves based on those classifications.
Yeah, that's right. And in one of the readings that you've got set for this week, the one that talks about homelessness and moral worth, I use Bourdieu's conceptual framework to look at the way that people become valued and the way that valuing attributions of value operate to kind of give meaning to poverty and inequality. And so that would be a good kind of a good thing to read alongside this. Although I'll also be talking about some other theoretical frameworks in a moment. So the idea of belonging is also quite important. We all need webs of relationships that we feel like we belong in, that give us some kind of sense of personal security in who we are. And these kinds of web of relationships are defined by shared understandings and boundaries between us and them, and what makes us different to them, and what makes us us, really. So belonging is also about emotional investments, desire for attachment to others, and it's really central to all of our lives. And it's going to be central to the way that these homeless young people negotiated their lives as well. Young people draw on resources that come from relationships that are situated within webs of meaning, and that these webs of meaning contribute to their identities. So that's one set of conceptual distinctions. The other set of conceptual distinctions that I want you to kind of have in mind as we kind of navigate this stuff, relates to these two conceptual frameworks, which I'm not going to go into in too much detail. I'll just kind of gesture towards them as I go through the data. But basically, there's one thing that's kind of useful for understanding an experience like homelessness is the individualization thesis, which you guys know about.
Yep.
And so Beck's basic argument here is that processes of social change over the past sort of 3 or 4 decades have created profound structural insecurity, the decline in traditional or taken for granted approaches to identity. And the important thing here is the emergence of individualized reflexivity as a way that people approach life. Basically, contemporary young people relate to the social world. Well, not all of them, but overwhelmingly the evidence is that there's a high level of individualized reflexivity. That is, young people relate to the world as choosing individuals, even when their lives are heavily circumscribed by structural inequalities, as, of course, the lives of homeless young people are. Another way of making sense of this is through the work of Foucault, who inspired the work of Peter Kelly, who you've read, looking at the idea of the entrepreneurial self. So Peter Kelly draws on Foucault's ideas, the idea of kind of discourse or discursive regimes, to look at the kind of main bodies of knowledge that are used to make sense of youth. And he says that the kind of identity that young people are meant to be able to construct is this kind of entrepreneurial self, or this kind of individualized and responsible subject. Now, one of the things that Foucault kind of points out is that every time a subject, an identity is kind of constructed and held up as good, there's always the dark side of that identity, the kind of other, the kind of binary opposite of this ideal identity, which people can often find themselves occupying and being treated on the basis of. And that kind of relates to some work that a theorist called Judith Butler has done, which basically says that our identities are performances of these kinds of ideas, of these kinds of discourses. So that basically brings the theory bit to an end, although that theory is really going to inform the way that we navigate through the stories that young people told me about their experiences, because what these theories do, and what really the purpose of social theory is to show that the most private and intimate details of people's lives are really embedded within enormous kind of macro level power relationships and historical processes of social change that have reshaped lots of young people's lives. So
before we move on, could you just tell us a little bit about what subjectivity is?
Oh, subjectivity, of course. Yeah, so subjectivity is a term which sociologists use to describe the way that resources for selfhood are made available, I suppose is one way of saying it. A useful distinction sometimes is between subjectivity and identity. Right? Or actually, yeah, let's make the distinction between self-identity and subjectivity, right? So one of the things about self-identity is we think of it as something that's kind of unique to us, and there's always something that's unique about us, of course, right? But the term subjectivity describes the social conditions which allow the formations of identity. And subjectivities are not things that we own necessarily. We go through life and we think we own our identities, but subjectivities, in a sense, are things that we occupy, right? That we kind of step up into. They're kind of identities made available to us by our social circumstances. Now, we don't just kind of step into them passively and do what we're told, right? We're always being creative with the subjectivities available to us, but it's that language of subjectivities that are available to us that I want to emphasize here. In the same way as when an academic comes to work, there's not unlimited ways that you can successfully be an academic. And in the same way as someone who works as an investment banker, there's not unlimited ways that they can do that. There's also not unlimited ways that we can be masculine. There's not unlimited ways that we can be feminine. And as I'm about to show, there's not unlimited ways that we can be homeless. Yeah. And in fact, homeless subjectivities reflect the kinds of power relationships that and material inequalities that you've been talking about in this course so far, that all social theorists really try to talk about. You know, Bourdieu and Foucault and everyone's kind of interested in this.
So one of the more general ways to think about that in terms of youth transitions, I suppose, is that various discourses like education and the labour market and, you know, the law and all that stuff provide us with, you know, some of these subjectivity positions to take up. But it's complex, right? We're not just a student, we're not just a criminal, and we're not just a worker or whatever. So the subject position that we take up is influenced by a kind of multiplicity of knowledge regimes in that Foucauldian sense.
That's right. So it's not a kind of straightforward thing where you're forced to be one thing. And because we all, particularly in modern societies, we all live in so many different contexts, we're actually forced to navigate lots of different subjectivities.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's not just up to us. And the mere fact that we see kind of very strong social patterns in who young people feel that they are reflects that there aren't unlimited subjectivities available to them.
Yeah.
And so I've just pulled up this slide here. Before I kind of go into this, basically I did a couple of projects, and what I did is I went and spoke to young people. I did these interviews with them, and I had the conversations with them, and I spoke to them about what it was like to go through homelessness, and how they felt like other people saw them, and how they saw themselves, and all of that. And we had some kind of fairly kind of intense conversations a lot of the time. And one of the most sort of strongest findings from both of these research projects can be summed up in this quote here. So this quote here is on the left-hand side. Sorry, it's from a young woman who was living with a friend in privately rented accommodation, and that friend decided that she wanted to move her boyfriend in. Her boyfriend had some fairly full-on problems with drugs. That girl's stuff started to go missing. Basically, the living situation became worse and worse, and then they kicked her out. Right? So she was kicked out. Now, she had just been fired from a retail job because she was 18, and the person she was working for wanted to hire a bunch of 16-year-olds that they could pay whatever, 3 cents an hour or whatever it is. And so she'd just been sacked as well. So, perfect crystallization of the kinds of structural conditions that so many young people are navigating, right? But here's the thing, right? This is the story she tells about becoming homeless, right? She says to herself, well, she says to me, sorry. She says, just the thought I was living in a youth refuge, a homeless people's place, is really intense. And I put these quotation marks around the term homeless people's place because as she was talking to me and telling this story, she actually used her fingers to put those little, those little talking marks that people put around things they say sometimes. To kind of air quotes, that's right. to kind of demonstrate. Often it's a way of achieving ironic distance, but I think here what she wanted to indicate to me was that a homeless people's place is associated with a very particular thing in her head. A homeless people's place is a kind of thing associated with a very particular and identifiable set of meanings. So she's about to tell us what being in a homeless person's place means. And she says, to be homeless was really intense, because I was unemployed, living off the dole, living in a youth refuge with barely any money to my name. And then she says, I always grew up with the thought that you have to work 9 to 5, you have to rent your own place, you have to support yourself, and if anyone helps you, you're a failure. So to think, oh, fuck, I'm a failure, it was really intense, the thought of it. She said to be living in a youth refuge is not successful, so it kind of brings shame, right? So it's pretty full on. I mean, she gets kicked out of home, she gets the sack, and yet she feels like a failure and she feels ashamed. But what I want to really kind of point to here is the way that she narrates this ideal life. She says, these are the things you have to do to not be a failure, right? And what are they? What you have to have is a successful normative transition to adulthood. That's really what she's saying. You have to be independent, you have to be employed, you've got to have your own house, and you've got to do it by yourself. And if you can't support yourself as an individual, then you are a failure and you should be ashamed. And that's what she experiences, even though at other times in the interview, she will say, well, it wasn't very cool. Like, I got kicked out of my house, I got the sack at the same time. It was a pretty tough situation.
Stuff going missing.
Yeah, stuff. So yeah. Another consequence of going through homelessness, though, is no.
Go on. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Me and Steve are messing around with PowerPoint here. Just want to talk about this other quote here on the right. Is that people these kinds of failure narratives is what I call them in my work is are really prevalent. The other really prevalent thing is isolation. So people, when they become homeless, a lot of the time find that, first of all, they're isolated from their previous associates simply because they live a very different life, but also people start to treat them differently. So the quote on the right is from a young woman who moved into a shed. This was in some work I did in regional Victoria, and she had a lot of mates prior to this. But she says, when I moved into the shed, that was all my friends started to not want to hang out with me. They just started being all weird, didn't invite me out anymore. I'd contact them and they said they were busy. I'd find out that they weren't. They were doing something with other people. So basically what she's saying is that when I became homeless, things changed. I was seen differently by my friends.
It's almost kind of against the stereotype that I was talking about earlier on, that the idea that homeless people have friends, right? Because they're always the stereotype is the isolation. Yeah,
that's absolutely true. Yeah, that's a really important point. And actually,
the social relations there and the kind of what I've talking previously about symbolic violence that person must be experiencing as their friends start treating them differently
That's
because
right.
of this situation. Must be kind of devastating.
Yeah, well, it is, and also, I mean, if you think about that image of the homeless person that you mentioned earlier, and that I'll kind of talk about in a second, the image here is of someone who's never been a normal person, right? They're almost they're always an alien, exactly, like a fringe dweller, you know. And you know, what this narrative shows is that this was a young woman who was popular. She had mates. She used to party heaps, you know, and simply by virtue of moving into a shed, things started to change straight away, you know. So here's this quote on the left here is actually from her boyfriend, and he says that people thought there was something wrong with me for not living in a stable house or with a stable family. They thought I'd messed up real bad. And I asked him, okay, so who was this? He was like, people of the town. I didn't know who they were, but they'd avoid me. He said, you can screw up and in 5 minutes everyone in town knows. Now, this was in a small country town, right? And that last bit, if you screw up and in 5 minutes everyone in town knows, all young people who live in the country will say those very things to you, right? You don't have to be homeless to feel like that. But what that did is really amplify the social isolation that the previous participant talked about, where the second he sort of stepped out that stable home, stable family kind of boundary, he was immediately, or at least he felt himself to have moved into a kind of different social space or something. He was kind of stigmatized and isolated because of that. And of course, the young people who had this experience, you know, they didn't like it so much. So here's a guy on the right saying, you know, I despise this town, I despise the people in it, I despise the buildings, the grass, the animals, you know. He basically, and this was a guy who experienced homelessness and then became a target for all sorts of things. People accused him of being a pedophile. People accused him of bashing them and all sorts. When I met him, he had his arm in a sling because he'd recently been bashed. My impression of this guy was honestly that, you know, fights are not something necessarily foreign to his life, right? But nevertheless, the second that he moved into this kind of homeless status, he immediately, I mean, being accused of molesting children and stuff, he immediately moved into this kind of outsider status within this kind of country town.
Yeah. So in that small town, the rare kind of person that doesn't fit in kind of draws that attention quite markedly. Yeah. Okay.
And it's interesting as well because that was a kind of very disadvantaged country town where there was a lot of people who were really struggling in their lives, very high levels of unemployment, and yet homelessness is seen as something other than that. It's not just about being poor or being working class. It's being that fringe dweller. And so the consequences of this are very profound. Like you really can't underestimate how much this affects young people. The quote on the left here is a great kind of depiction of this, where here's a guy saying, you know, it's hard. I don't feel like I'm anything. I can't stand up and talk to people. There was a time when I could, but now I can't. It's just messed up. And he says that was back when I was back in school, right? Still linked up with those institutions, they're giving those relationships, or indeed that symbolic capital that Bourdieu might say, right? And then I said, when you're on the streets, and he interrupted me and said, when I'm on the streets, I don't feel like I'm anything. Now, that's pretty full on. Like, when I'm on the streets, I'm not a person, you know? And that's really what he kind of thought. And the quote on the right kind of shows the way that another kind of consequence of that, where this person basically says that he was so isolated and stigmatized when he went through homelessness that he felt like he was on drugs. He felt like his mind was elsewhere, you know, like he was affected by
perception of reality starts to change.
Yeah, his whole perception of reality. He walked around and he just felt like a different kind of person. Exactly. Yeah. So, yes. So homelessness is a challenge to young people's identity. Like the young woman who put air quotes around a homeless people's place, experiencing homelessness moves you out of the culturally expected pathways of youth and puts you somewhere else, right? It positions you in this kind of stigmatized social space. And in the most extreme example, young people experience themselves as nothing, as not people at all. So it kind of disengages people from the kind of socially available sources of a positive identities. It makes them isolated. And it's a very profound experience for people's sense of self anyway. So here are the stereotypes that Steve talked about before. All I want to say about these really is how they're exactly the stereotypes that Steve's students visualize in their head. When these are two young people in Melbourne who, you know, said this is kind of how people see the homeless, right? Alcoholics, leeching off society. It's very important by begging for change and whatnot, not trying to get a job, going through trash cans and not caring about their situation, scraggling, couldn't care less about their hygiene and whatnot. What I want to point to here is the way that the homeless individual here is positioned as a leech, right? As a kind of someone who's taking something away from others that they don't deserve. Also, it's interesting that a lot of the stereotypes align homeless people with garbage, right? Trash is a really evocative metaphor that lots of young people use. Um, young people often, the gutter is another kind of space that, they're positioned as literally refuse, right?
And this is homeless people talking
This
about
is
homeless people.
homeless people talking about homeless people, both as stereotypes, but later on I'm going to talk about how also, these stereotypes are very powerful.
Yeah.
Anyway,
It's interesting in terms of the notion of reflexivity that we've talked about earlier on too, in terms of the reflexive positioning of oneself outside of those stereotypes while being kind of
affected by
part
them.
of the field, I suppose.
Totally, yeah. So, the same people who will be able to articulate this stereotype here. Here's another quote, the big raggy jacket. There's the beard in this one, beard out here, no teeth, like a bum, right? The bum image is just so evocative. We all know what that looks like, right? And so even the same people that were able to critique that stereotype will later on feel like they have failed as individuals for experiencing homelessness. So there's the stereotype. You can kind of read that slide. It's kind of about irresponsibility and immorality, really.
Yep.
So, that's actually the same data as before. So we skip that slide. Thanks.
Yep.
So here's another guy who's saying, this is kind of articulating the consequences of individualization. This is a guy who's, I won't read this whole quote out, but basically what he's saying was, I was a good kid. I went to school and I had a bank account. I was doing good. Then I became homeless. I had to use charities in order to get resources, and I felt pathetic. And what he said was, you feel pathetic. You think, look what I've come down to. And then this is really interesting, right? This speaks to that what you were just saying before, is that he says, it's not because you're a bum or because you're a loser, it's because you've let yourself get like that. You've put yourself in that situation. So this guy, at the same time, distances himself from the stereotype of homelessness, whilst literally in the same sentence blaming himself for the fact that this was a guy who had to leave his mum's house because her and like 20 bikies used the house to just smoke meth constantly. Wasn't a very cool place for a 15-year-old kid to be. But he feels like he's put himself in this situation. And they all feel like this. So these are the kind of these narratives of disempowerment, and it shows the very specific consequences of individualization on young people who experience very profound poverty.
Really makes the idea of choice, and I'm using inverted air quotes here, something that, from a sociological perspective, we have to unpack a lot more.
Yeah.
The idea that young people choose to be homeless in those situations, well, maybe there, is a choice going on there, but is it a choice kind of thing?
Well, that's right.
We touched on that a little bit earlier in the course material.
That's right.
Just relating to that.
Choice is, for sociologically in general, and particularly when you're looking at something like this, not a very useful term to try to figure out how people end up living the kinds of lives that they live. I mean, this guy did choose to leave his house, but I would have done the same thing, right? And he would have preferred not to be homeless, as this quote indicates. Yeah. So one of the things I also wanted to emphasize here is that young people are kicked out, or they choose to leave horrible situations. But the thing is, one of the things that really struck me is actually how normal, conventional, and conservative most of the young people I spoke to are. Like, most of these young people are invested in the same kinds of good life as everyone else. Like, here's a guy who says, I said, what do you want for your life? And he says, I want to cruise into the city in a good car and have a house and go to dinner with my mates and be someone respectable one day. That's what he wants to say, right? And being someone respectable, I mean, that's what they want. Now, of course, the whole idea of respectability is very deeply entwined with like notions of symbolic violence and all of that. But that's what these young people want. And what the rest of these quotes on this slide indicate is that young people have got very kind of individualized ideas of how you do this and how you become respectable. So these participants, one that I've called Melissa and one that I've called Emma, are both saying you get strength and you feel good about yourself by managing your own life successfully. That's what they say. I asked them questions like, where do you get your strength from? Me is the answer. And of course, that's the only answer they can give because they don't have a community around them. This is what Beck is saying with the kind of way that collective social bonds have been dissolving while structural inequalities have remained, right? These young people are poorer than working class. They would kill to be working class because that would mean that they would have work and they would have social relationships around them and they would have a home.
Yep.
So just shows the way that individualized definitions of how to conduct your life are really important. So in the rest of the kind of what I want to talk about here, I'm going to talk about the way that individualization and individualized ways of governing your life are mobilized by young people in different ways. That is, individualized definitions of failure and success are mobilized by young people who have experienced success as well, right? So this is one of the ironies about individualization, about the entrepreneurial self. What I'm going to say in the next little bit is that basically going into homelessness is experienced in an individualized way, and so it creates feelings of shame. But when young people leave homelessness, they do that in an individualized way as well, and it makes them feel proud of themselves. It makes them feel like responsible individuals, and it makes them feel like responsible adults. And here's a participant here, the top participant here. The top participant was really it was really full-on interview. Like, she was abandoned by her mum when she was 10. She was on the streets for 11 years. Is addicted to heroin for most of that time. Miracle she's alive. Anyway, so what she said, she was exiting homelessness at the time. She was living in a kind of refuge, and she said, well, I said, what do you do? And she says, well, what she says in this quote is that I look deep inside myself, right? This is that reflexivity. She says, I isolated myself. I want to take in everything about myself. I surrounded myself with workers and doctors and stuff. And I kept going through a process where I was realizing who the hell I was. For her, exiting homelessness is about self-discovery, right? Self-discovery, like, that's what we're all meant to be doing as late modern subjects. That's kind of the purpose of reflexivity in an ideal sense, is that we kind of self-actualize. Well, that's the language that she has available to her to describe what is actually a process of moving off the street into a refuge, right? Here's another young woman. This was the girlfriend of the guy who had left home because his mum was doing heaps of meth with bikies. And she says, I don't like people feeling sorry for me, right? Why should they feel sorry for me? I put myself through it. It's my fault I put myself through things like that. Now, that is just, by the way, patently untrue, right? But nevertheless, it's just obviously untrue if you listen to what actually happened to her. Anyway, but she says, homelessness was my fault, but I needed that experience to be me now, and I found myself from getting out of homelessness. I've grown up into an independent woman. I'm not a little girl anymore. That makes me really proud of myself. So for her, leaving homelessness makes her feel like a responsible individual, of course, because it reflects well on her morally, right? First, I was a failure, and it was my fault that I was homeless. But now I'm a success because I left homelessness. Yeah. And that's her transition to adulthood as well, because that's what the
narrative of the self.
That's right, the narrative of the responsibilized self as well, because that's the whole idea of the transition to adulthood, right? Is that we're adults when we're responsible for ourselves, right? Well, she's responsible for herself now, and she feels like an adult. Yep. 18 when she's talking here.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Which is actually much earlier.
Much earlier.
The kind of middle class transition.
That's right, and a lot of them will actually talk about how they grew up very quickly. Yeah. So what these kinds of narratives show is that the idea of self-reliance is very important. It's kind of, if you want to, self-reliant subjectivities in a way is what all of these young people are called upon to kind of experience. But personal responsibility is a very kind of morally loaded idea. If you do well, then you look great. If you do badly, you don't look so good. You look morally culpable for your own disadvantage, and often you experience yourself in those terms.
Okay.
Yeah. So now, in the next kind of 10 minutes or so, what I want to do is kind of go through some material which demonstrates one of the things we discussed earlier, which is that nobody, I don't know, it's a dumb saying, right? But no man is an island, right? It's also a kind of, no man or woman. Anyway, so all of these young people existed within webs of relationships, always. And the way that they dealt with their relationships was very interesting in this project. And it really reflected a lot of the kind of social and cultural dynamics that they were embedded within. It really reflected the importance of reflexivity. These young people kind of manage their relationships reflexively. Looking at relationships shows that relationships are intrinsic to identity. And managing relationships are one of the ways in which young people construct identities in the context of profound inequality. So there's different ways that they do that, but all of them are kind of reflexive responses to this disempowerment. Mm-hmm. So there's a few patterns that go on. One thing that a lot of young people told me was that being homeless is about trying to remain as independent as possible. And the reason for this is that the streets are very dangerous places. And there are conflicts over resources, there's conflicts over money, there's conflicts over drugs, and there's just conflicts, right? Because you've got people who are living hand to mouth and they're close to each other. You get alliances that form up and then dissolve and fight. And anyway, so what a lot of young people said was that, like, these young people are saying, I'm choosy of who I associate with because of the situations of in life. I can't trust anyone. And here's another participant saying that I stick to myself. You can only rely on yourself. So this is a strategy which basically says if I isolate myself from others, I avoid a lot of the bullshit that goes along with street life, right? I avoid fights. I don't have to share resources that are very scarce. And so independence here was framed as a way of managing danger and material need.
And also as a way of, I suppose, of expressing the fact that they've been let down by a lot of other people
That's
before and
right.
had to build up resilience
Absolutely.
themselves.
Good point. Because of course, you know, these are young people who were probably abused at home, exactly, and then they come out on the street, they're exploited. Many young people who become homeless are then sexually abused whilst homeless. I mean, the people that they've experienced in their lives often aren't very good. But there's another dynamic here which I want to emphasize, which I thought was really interesting. Right, this is a big quote. But people listening, you know, if you read it, I think it's quite interesting because one of the things that really shocks me talking to these young people is that, stereotypes aside, the people who hate homeless people the most, right, are other homeless people. Okay, that is, I have never heard, like, I have for a researcher coming in and trying to criticize stigmatization, the people who will stigmatize homeless people the most are always or have been homeless, right? And why? Because they feel like other homeless people reflect badly on themselves. Because you know, so here's a story. Here's a young woman. I'll skip the first paragraph, right? But she says she was at a refuge, right? And she says, when I was at a refuge, I had another resident come up to me and say, do you know where to score some heroin around the city? And I looked at her and I'm like, no, I fucking don't. And I looked at her and I thought to myself, you're the kind of person everyone has stereotyped me for, and it's not fair. I'm nothing like you. I don't do drugs. Like, basically what she's saying is, like, I asked her, where do you think stigmatization comes from? And she's like, all the other homeless people are gross, right? And that's why I'm stigmatized. So she's not criticizing stigmatization, but what she wants to say is, you know, they deserve to be stigmatized, but I don't. And what she actually did was she remained independent from other young people, not just as a way of surviving materially, but actually of a way of distancing herself from the concept of homelessness, right? So she basically hated homeless people more than anyone else that I spoke to. I really remember the disgust in her voice when she talked about the people that she met. And she basically said, you know, I won't hang out with these people because they're horrible. But that was a way of crafting a moral self, right? Her behaving in a kind of symbolically violent way towards them was a way of constructing a self that was responsible, that was moral, that was individualized and reflexive.
From the resources she had at her disposal.
Exactly, from the resources that she had at her disposal. Now, here's another thing that people did. Not everyone remained independent, right? A lot of them did, but another thing that young people did was that they formed these kind of street families. And this is what they kind of described these groups as. They made contact with other young people on the street, and they became like this collective group that helped each other out with resources, that fought on one another's behalf. And here's a young person that I spoke to here. She'd been homeless for 9 years, and she was one of the people I spoke to where basically leaving homelessness wasn't really on her agenda. Like, she says a couple of times, like, you know, it'd be good to have a home, but basically her life is this collective on the street. And she says, you know, the street is my family. They're all like brothers and sisters to me. And then she says something very interesting. She says, what I believe in is that you make your own family, right? That is individualization, straight up. That is like, I will choose my social bonds, and I will choose who my family is, right? And she is saying, you know, my parents, her parents, by the way, had let her down as parents quite significantly. She was like, you know, I prefer my street family rather than my regular family because they know how to fight, they know how to look after people, they know how to do all that. This family on the street suits my life. This is who I want to be. So here, family-like relationships are framed as an active choice and a way of dealing with street life and a way of constructing a sense of belonging. She described herself as a kind of street mother who, when new young people came onto the street, she would teach them how to deal with services and just how to survive, who to talk to, who not to talk to, how to talk, when to open your mouth and when to close your mouth. You know, all of these kind of little skills that young people needed to avoid often being bashed or really just to survive.
Where to go and where not to go.
Where to go and where not to go, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So, oh yes, okay. So this is the process of making home. This is the final step in our story, right? So, when young people decide to make a home, what they do is they manage themselves as individuals and they manage their relationships as individuals. And they go through a process of what I've called reflexive relationship management, which is a way of escaping homelessness and making a home. And what this quote says is, here's the first section. Now, the second paragraph of this was on a previous slide, or the third paragraph of this was on a previous slide, sorry. But it's part of this longer narrative that Emma told me about changing her relationships in order to leave homelessness. And basically, in this quote, what she says is, she sat down one day and she made a list of every single person that she knew. Literally, she had a list with 3 columns, and she put the people that she knew into 3 columns: bad people, good people, and maybe people. right? And then she listed everyone that she knew, put them in one of those columns, and then she came up with these strategies as to how to deal with these people if she met them according to where they were on her list. So if they're a good person, she'd pursue a relationship with them. If they're a bad person, they come up to her, she said something like, "What I'll tell them is I have to go and pay a bill," right? So she has these strategies involved because she wants to distance herself from people who are going to lead her back into trouble, but also people who no longer represent the kind of life that she wants to live, right? It's very reflexive. It's profoundly responsible, actually. It's much more rational than any of us are usually about our relationships. I mean, very few people actually do this, right? But what she does, she makes a list of people she knows. She figures out strategies for how to deal with them all. Then she isolates herself, as she said in a previous slide, and she realizes who the hell she is. And this kind of process of self-discovery is actually a process of self-reformation in a kind of new relational context. Another participant called James said effectively the same thing in one sentence. He said, if you come from an environment that's the wrong environment, you've got to step up and look at your circle. And that's what you do. You step up and look at your circle. You think, who's around me and where am I going to go if I hang out with these people?
What did Emma do with the maybe people?
I can't remember.
Yeah.
I can't remember. I mean, Emma's interview was, I almost said nothing. It was this long monologue where I just kind of listened to what she was going on.
Ones,
yeah. So I can't remember what she did, but she was very clear on who the good people were. And
it's really interesting to have a line ready to avoid bad people that she
I
doesn't
know.
want to talk to.
I have to pay a bill.
Where, like in our own comfortable lives, if we want to avoid people, we just shut the door, turn off the phone.
Totally.
We don't, so it's a kind of different way of managing that kind of avoidance.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things to keep in mind, we might not sort of have time to go too far into it now, but is that going through refuges and stuff is about constructing a responsibilized subjectivity. And the reason for this is that young people get access to services by going through gatekeeper adults who will only give them access to services if they perform a particular kind of identity, and that is an individualized and responsibilized identity. You have to be able to say, I'm an individual, I'm responsible for what's happened to me, and now I'm getting my life back together. And so these actually reflect one of the other things that Ulrich Beck says, which is about the way that people's identities are impacted by social institutions, right? Our institutions now, everything from welfare institutions to any other institution we deal with, treat us as individuals. And in order to navigate them, we have to become individuals, at least to some degree.
Okay.
So that's what she does to kind of make a home, and she manages her relationships in order to kind of do that. So reflexive relationship management has a few dimensions here. It's about dealing with inequality, danger, and material deprivation, but it's also really crucially about the performance of a particular subjectivity, right? About stepping into those entrepreneurial discourses that Peter Kelly talks about and using them to make sense of others, and in so doing to make sense of yourself. It's an active process in that sense. So so we'll I think what we might actually do is we should probably skip that actually because we're running out of time. But you can look at the slide there. It kind of just summarizes stuff that I've just said. So skip that too. We'll go here. So let's sum up a little bit here. What is homelessness? That's the question. Well, homelessness is not a place outside of the normal functioning of society, right? Given the way that the youth bureau is structured now, it is perfectly natural that we should have homelessness. It's inevitable, right? Homelessness is the experience of a particular form of individualized inequality, right? But what happens when people experience this inequality is that they get linked up to a very particular set of meanings which reflect the way that poverty and homelessness is understood in a way that is in a world that's very individualized, and where the individual is really the kind of the main idea that people use to make sense of others. And so young people experience homelessness from subjectivities that are constructed by the entrepreneurial discourses that Peter Kelly identifies. In experiencing homelessness, what they kind of do is they step into these subjectivities and make sense of their lives through them. Now, that has interesting and creative consequences, as we've seen when we look at young people's all of these different narratives. But these entrepreneurial discourses are basic to who these young people are. So when young people become homeless, the outcome here is shame and self-blame. You're stepping into this kind of stigmatized location. But when they leave homelessness, the same discourses get kind of taken up and made into something else, right? Where in the move to homelessness, they get turned into a subjectivity that feels shame. In the move out, they get turned into a subjectivity that feels pride and strength and responsibility in adulthood, right? It's the same resources being used creatively in different ways. This also is reflected in young people's relationship management, in which they actively and reflexively construct their social relationships in order to respond to the insecurity of homelessness. All of this is done through an ethic of individual agency. What I mean by an ethic is that it's kind of a set of ideas that has moral overtones. You're supposed to do it, and if you do it wrong, you will feel like you have failed. So it's a kind of individualized form of disadvantage which forces people to come to terms with the implications of what it means to be that homeless person. And this kind of seeps through into all aspects of their lives. So finally, just to conclude, homelessness can tell us something about contemporary youth, and it reflects something very widespread about the evidence about youth subjectivities, which is that contemporary young people experience inequality as individuals. And they navigate these structures in individualistic and reflexive ways because that's what's available to them. The kinds of collective identities that were available to poor young people in the past are simply not there in most contexts.
Yeah. Yeah.
So these identities, the identities of young people and the identities of young people who go through homelessness, are actually part of a kind of broader tapestry of social change. And they kind of emerge from these processes of social change and are related to the meaning that poverty has in contemporary modern societies like ours.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thanks a lot for that.
No worries.
So I'll just put a little link there at the end of this to a recent story that appeared in a thing that happened in the UK where a model described how he actually bases some of his look on homeless people.
Oh, yeah.
And I just wanted to flag that now, just to connect it later off into the course when I talk about hipsters and bogans and the way that the cultural appropriation of image within what we call hipster culture, or for want of a better word, actually disconnects it from the real world. So, wearing a native Indian headdress to a festival, or in this sense, drawing inspiration from homelessness.
It's funny, like I look homeless, I'm so edgy.
Yeah, that's
you
right.
know, that's so cosmopolitan and cool.
Yeah. So I just want to kind of touch upon the symbolic nature of that while we were talking about the actual real notions of homeless here, and touch on a bit about that, how these things actually in some, very privileged cultures become a resource to draw on to kind of present yourself in an ironic way, which, we can talk about the morals and ethics of that later in the course. Okay, thanks a lot for that, Dave.
No worries, Steve.
Conclude it there. That was fun. And I hope you enjoy hearing someone's disembodied voice and having a bit of a conversation. So Dave is the first guest lecturer in the course. We'll have Julia, Pam, and Alistair later on in the course. Thank you.